Good evening, everybody. My name's James Lovelock. I'm a lecturer in musical theatre at the University of Wolverhampton, and I'm delighted today to welcome Stafford Arima from Theatre Calgary, the Artistic Director of Theatre Calgary. And we're going to talk a little bit today about some of Stafford's work and also a little bit particularly about Allegiance, which was on Broadway, I believe, in 2016. Yeah, I'm obviously we're really looking forward to that. Just to remind everybody that today's session is being recorded, so please don't share any personal information online. And if you want to ask any questions at any stage, there's a Q&A function at the bottom, and I'll keep my eye on that. And we will obviously try and answer those questions as we go. So thank you so much for joining us, Stafford. It's a real pleasure to see you again. And I was just wondering if you could give us just a little bit of a background about some of the work that you've done and kind of your journey into the musical theatre industry.
Well, it's great to see you, James, and it's really quite an honor to be a part of this webinar. You know, as much as we've all been kind of railing against the pandemic, I think one of the brightest lights that have come out of the pandemic is this Zoom, and that we're able to kind of, you know, through a couple of clicks, be connected. And as I think for anyone who loves the theater, we know that connectivity is absolutely integral to this art form. Even though we're not on a stage, we are at least finding a way to connect. I'm in Canada, you're in the UK, and so up on all levels. You know, my passion for musical theater started when I was 11 years old, and I saw Andrew Lloyd Webber's production and Hal Prince's production of Evita at the Shubert Theater in Los Angeles. I was dragged to the theater by my mother, who loved the theater. And I was there vacationing over the kind of spring break, the March break area of time. And I was in Los Angeles as an 11-year-old. I wanted to go and see Universal Studios and Disneyland and SeaWorld. I didn't want to go to some dark space about somebody called an Evita. And, you know, the interesting thing, James, is because Evita at that time, 1980, was the Hamilton of today. It was the hottest ticket in America after the incredible production in London with Elaine Page. Obviously, it came over to the United States, and we sat in the last row of like the second balcony, and the Shubert Theater in Los Angeles, which doesn't exist anymore, was a barn. We call it a barn. It was just so big. And I sat there sulking with my mother, and the lights dimmed. And all I remember, interestingly, was that everybody looked like they were tiny ants, little ants, running around this bare stage. But I was literally bitten by the theater bug. And at 11 years old, I became enamored with this art form. And jump cut many years later, I'm originally from Toronto, Canada, and born and bred there. And I was assisting the director of Evita, Mr. Prince, on Showboat. So Showboat started off in Toronto before it went to New York and the West End. This beautiful, very large revival of the piece. And so it's such an interesting journey to kind of look at how you start as a foolish child sulking in the Shubert Theater, experiencing Hal Prince's production of Evita, and decades later sitting in a rehearsal room with him as he was directing Showboat. You know, I've had an incredibly blessed and fortunate experience of being a kid from Toronto who went to the theater and loved the theater, and inevitably, in my late 20s, I moved to New York City and had an incredible opportunity to work alongside some amazing mentors. Hal Prince, for example, one of them, Mike Ockrent, who's no longer with us, but directed that beautiful production of the original production of Crazy for You. Frank Galati, an American director and writer who is probably best known from his work of directing the original production of Ragtime, also writing The Grapes of Wrath adaptation that he did. Some amazing theater creators, and I inevitably continued to pursue my dreams, and then got to the West End and directed my own production of Ragtime with Maria Friedman and an incredible cast, and you know, the Jump Cut then got a chance to direct the revisal of Carrie, the musical, which of course I'm sure all of the wonderful Brits know about. About it originating at the at Stratford upon Avon, directing Allegiance with Lea Salonga on Broadway. So, you know, in many ways, James, it's very weird to kind of talk about yourself in this way, but I feel so blessed and so honored to have been privy to some really great experiences, and now artistic directing this great theater up in Canada, Theatre Calgary, as you know, maybe my act 3 in a Shakespearean 5-act structure, a new adventure, artistic directing.
And Theatre Calgary is a lovely theatre. I was very lucky to visit that a couple of years ago, and you're doing some wonderful work there and some really lovely shows there as well. I was interested to talk to you a little bit about, and I think we talked about this before when we met, but thinking about seeing yourself represented in musical theatre, and whether that's happened or where that's happened for you during this wonderful journey that you've been talking to us about.
Yeah, it's such an interesting, it's to observe, you know, I think about all of the wonderful shows, and I'm just going to speak specifically about Asian representation, as I am Asian. My family, all born in Canada. My grandparents born in Japan and China. I'm actually kind of half Chinese, half Japanese, but my family born in Canada. So yeah, when, you know, growing up, you go to the musicals and you see Pacific Overtures, or you see King and I, or Miss Saigon, or, you know, and I think as a young person, I didn't realize at the time that, oh, there's someone up there that at least looks like me, or looks like something that I would, you know. But for the most part, obviously, which is why I think this topic is so kind of relevant today, as we're looking into representation of all cultures, is that there wasn't a great deal of representation on the stage, and more so, which I only realized later, that there wasn't a great deal of representation behind the scenes. You know, one of the greatest aspects about Allegiance that I feel so proud of is that the director was Asian, the composer and lyricist were Asian, and one of our producers was Asian. Our sound designer was Asian. Aside from the cast, obviously it was a predominantly Asian cast, but when you have 4 Asian members of the creative team who are behind the scenes in prominent positions, it really broke all conventions. Even great shows with great Asian representation on stage, Saigon, Pacific Overtures, King and I, you know, Flower Drum Song, can't connect to that kind of representation on its creative team. So, you know, I think in many ways what Allegiance has the capacity of doing not just entertaining or educating an audience, is illuminating a narrative about, you know, the artistic vitality and value of at least some of the creative team being Asian. And so that representation, not only on stage but behind the scenes, I think is what makes Allegiance such an interesting point of conversation. Whether or not you like the show or not, whether or not you think that it's good or bad, it has its place, you know, in the kind of Broadway kind of canon of a musical that defied all odds, one, getting to Broadway, two, a musical about the Japanese American internment. I mean, now that's a real humsinger. Like, we talked about Crazy for You. It's no Crazy for You. It's no Guys and Dolls. But we became the first ever musical to kind of deal with the internment in a way that, you know, maybe excited some, maybe bored others, but that's not really what we're here to discuss. We're here to kind of represent or to at least talk about the representation that happened. And I hope that in many ways shows like Allegiance can push other people to know that it is possible.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I love about Allegiance is how well, there's a number of things I love about Allegiance, but I was thinking particularly about the idea of, and this is something I've talked about with my students as well, how when the history of musical theatre is written, it's written very much from a white perspective, and actually that's also true of history as well, that so many things get left out. And the fact that this is an Asian American story, it's not a Japanese story that happens in Japan that's then happening in America. There's something about this being part of the American history that's been perhaps, well, definitely overlooked. And I was interested in how you kind of were able to sort of recover those sort of things, because I know George Takei was very involved early on in terms of the ideas and everything. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how it developed.
Yes, you know, it's interesting when you think of any piece going from page to stage. There is an incredible amount of work that goes along that. Not only in many ways, James, is this an American story, it's a North American story, because my father and my father's family, my grandmother, my aunts, my uncle, were interned in Canada. So basically, the exact same thing happened in Canada. Once there was this kind of, fear of the anyone that looked Japanese or was Japanese, even though that they were American or Canadian born, they were thrown into these internment camps, and my family was. So, I think in many ways what meant so much to me is I received an email from the composer and the producer about in 2008, and said to them, they asked, is this something that you'd be interested in? And of course, I shared just what I shared with you. My family was interned, so absolutely. And it really, from 2008 to 2012, 4 years of development before we had our out-of-town tryout at the Globe. And then inevitably, actually it was 2015 that we opened on Broadway and closed in 2016. So you think of 2008 all the way to 2016, an 8-year journey. And it was so important for us to get it right. George Takei definitely got it right because he was interned as a young person, so he had experienced it from that kind of lens. My father and my family, being interned, got to experience and get to know what was the Canadian experience like. Now, obviously, slightly different than the American, but the emotional currents of what it felt like just to be thrown into these cages. I remember my father talking about when they were rounded up and they were taken to a place called Hastings Park, which was kind of like not a zoo, but they were thrown into the chicken coops and also into horse stalls, and the smell of horse's urine, and they were kept there for a number of days before they were then shipped off to the actual internment camps. So in getting all this kind of first-hand information, it was really important for us to infuse the libretto and the lyrics with that kind of truth. And what's interesting, one of the criticisms about Allegiance was the fact that many people felt that it wasn't being authentic because the characters were not downtrodden, they weren't sad, they weren't, and the reality is the and this is true in both the American side and the Canadian side, once they knew they were in these camps and it was going to be, I guess, this is where we are, they decided we're going to make the best of our situation. And that's when they kind of, created baseball teams, and they created their own churches, and, and they had parties and they had dances, because they weren't going to, as a group of people, sit there and just cry and be sad. Yes, there were emotional moments. Yes, people died. My grandmother died in the camps. But the notion of, and it's a phrase that's used in the musical, gaman, and this notion of, we have got to look at adversity staring at us in the face and make a decision. Do we succumb to it, or do we kind of reach over it? And gaman, and another very famous Japanese word, shikataganai. Shikataganai was a phrase that was used to kind of say, what is. I guess, what was that song? Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. And shikataganai was used quite a bit because what else can they do? They can either just wallow in self-pity and horribleness, or make the best out of it. And that is what they did. So kind of going back to your question, it was so important for us to put on that stage, even though they were not real people, in the sense of the Kimura family were just a kind of, a conglomerate of lots of different stories, but that we wanted to tell the true story. And we succeeded in telling that true story.
And it's so beautiful as well, because, and I remember again talking to people about the idea of how specificity, how the more specific something is, the more universal it becomes, and so that there was all of this really specific information, and then so many different ways that people could connect to the story, whether it's through their kind of family heritage, or whether it's from people outside of the Asian community or outside of the Japanese community. And thinking about relationships between fathers and sons, or interracial relationships, all sorts of stories there. And I was interested in how the kind of, as a director, how you sort of piece together all the different components and all the different stories that are going on within a huge musical like Allegiance.
Well, it takes the brilliance of a librettist, Marcus Cito, who wrote the book, to be part of the kind of puzzle of it all. How do we take all of these very different stories and weave them together in a tapestry that narratively is exciting, has drama, has humor, is emotional, is human. And also, as we kind of talked earlier, once again, to remind everyone, from 2008 to 2012, we had 4 years of, R&D, of workshops and readings and characters that exist still in the play, and some that don't even exist anymore. The name of characters changing. Characters that once used to sing don't sing anymore. So in many ways, what I say is, not only did we have an incredible librettist who was able to kind of really work with us, we had an amazing producer. And I share that because it takes a village to create a show. But it also takes one person, or at least, we'll just call it the producer, who believes in the process, who believes in the show so much that they will invest not only money, but invest a kind of spirit and energy and a capacity to take something that started in 2008 all the way to Broadway to 2015, 7 years of dedication. So, in many ways, because we had all of these wonderful people who believed in telling the story. I say this not in any disrespect to the show, but I don't think anybody expected that Allegiance was going to run for like Phantom for 35 years. It wasn't about the kind of length. It was about getting there. I remember having conversations with George Takei about the notion of just to get there, just to even open the show. And knowing that there would be a lot of attention around any Broadway show. It doesn't matter if it's a Phantom or if it's an Allegiance. There's always attention. The eyes are on this piece, the interviews, the CNNs, the New York Times, all of that stuff. And I think for George, the fact that people were talking about this event, and as you said, James, there are still people who are like, that didn't happen. I didn't learn that in school. I remember, James, an interesting moment. We were in previews, and for those of you who've seen the show, if you want to go that place, it's an emotional ending, and not because it's sad, but because there's hope and there's an opportunity for this kind of sense of forgiveness and moving on, second chances. And these two friends were, she was probably in her maybe 60s, and her husband. She was crying, and he was patting her on the back and kind of saying, it's okay, darling. And she just was very moved, and I was right behind them. And I heard him say, oh, don't cry, darling, don't cry. They got it all wrong. They were only in there for 4 months. And I thought to myself, well, one, we don't know why she's crying. Maybe she's crying because she just was emotionally connected to the end of the story. But the notion that he said they got it all wrong, they were only in there for 4 months, I almost literally wanted to tap him on the shoulder and say, actually, no, my father was in there for 4 years. But I didn't, just to be, Canadian nice boy. I was being very respectful. But I thought the power of out of sight, out of mind, sweep it under the carpet. We couldn't have done something like that. It's not possible. And as you said, most of the history books of my generation were written by people who we never talked about it in Canadian history. It was never brought up in school, and it wasn't brought up also on the American side either. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting to navigate a political story that actually had a lot of relevance, when the wall and the people, crossing over the borders, pushing people out, caging kids. It was the relevancy of this piece was kind of crazy, and in a good way. But I think a lot of people didn't necessarily want to believe that history was repeating itself. But for those who, I know we had a bunch of lots of Jewish friends who came to the show completely immersed into it on all levels, not because they're Japanese American, because they understood regarding the Holocaust, they understood regarding World War II and what was happening in all different parts of the world of genocide and throwing people away. And so the universality of the piece, although I think some people might not see it or feel it immediately, after experiencing, can understand, hey, maybe I wasn't thrown into a camp, but I understand what adversity is. I understand what it means to have to climb a Mount Everest, and how do you do it with grace and spirit and generosity.
I think that's so true. And I think one of the things, going back to an earlier point we were talking about, how different the piece is, having had Asian writers, Asian director, Asian producer, and sound designer. It really changes, doesn't it, when we're telling these stories, when you're telling these stories from inside the community rather than the stories being told about the community, which perhaps is true of a lot of the other musicals with Asian characters in Broadway history. And I
Yeah,
was
I
wondering
mean, I mean,
about that.
oh, go on. Yeah, I mean, I think when you say Broadway history, I mean, I think of Flower Drum Song. The revisal of Flower Drum Song was written by David Henry Hwang, the American playwright, but the original inception was not. Um, Pacific Overture, Stephen Sondheim, definitely, so I actually don't know of any Broadway musical that has Asian characters written by Asian, at least one, even David definitely on Flower Drum Song, but on South Pacific, King and I, and great shows. So let's also make sure that that's stated. I don't have any issue with a King and I or Miss Saigon. They exist. And I enjoyed them immensely, both of those shows, and would go and see them again. I'm not going to stand up and protest because the Les Mis writers are not Asian. But I think in many ways, as we move into a much more open conversation that's happening, the awareness is so much more present than it was even 5-10 years ago. I think it's only a good thing that this is happening, not just because the representation is there. Great, we hire Asian people, Black writers, Indigenous writers. It's not about that. I mean, it is, but the main thing is that the stories that live within these cultures that have been sometimes passed down from generation to generation are given a platform to be experienced. Theater is there to move, touch, and inspire, to engage an audience in provocative conversation. So once again, if you have a story about, an Asian family or a Black family or a Latinx family, whatever it might be, and those stories are being brought to life by that culture or that individual that can, on some level, connect to that culture, you're getting that much more towards authenticity and a kind of genuineness, a verisimilitude of narrative telling. Now, I'm going to say something that could be controversial. That does not mean that if you are not a Black writer or a Black person, that you can never, ever write a Black character. Because I feel in many ways, if we go down that conversation, the next question is, I identify as a male, as a he, him. Can I pretend I'm a writer? Can I write a female character? Or can I only write, and now I'll just say this, I just thought of it now. I'm Canadian, but I am Asian. Could I write an Irish character? So it's an interesting conversation that I think has many kind of tentacles and kind of controversial ideas. However, what we are saying in this conversation, I think, or here, is that it is important, as we're moving towards an awareness of stories and cultures, that we give the platform first and foremost to those who either experienced it or whose ancestors or fathers or great grandparents experienced it as well, and not to close the doors on those groups of friends who have these stories as part of their generational kind of DNA.
Mm. I mean, as many people watching will know, I work particularly with LGBTQ representation, and the question I've been trying to move towards, rather than who should tell the stories, is the question of what do we gain when the stories are told from people within the communities. and thinking about it that way. And I think Allegiance is such a great example of maybe what you might call, I don't know whether you call it Asian gain, or the fact that there are things in that show that could not have been part of that show if they had not, or that are unlikely to be part of the show if they had not been written and kind of looked after by this team that had a large number of Asian people as part of it. And I was thinking when I was watching it, the death of the grandfather in Allegiance is so, sorry, that's a bit of a spoiler if you haven't seen it, but it's so beautifully done, and I couldn't think of any. It was so unexpected to me, but of course it wouldn't necessarily be if you were somebody that knew how that culture worked and what the symbols were. And I'm just interested in what particular moments in Allegiance you think might be examples of that sort of thing.
Well, I think in many ways, directorially speaking, as the director of the piece, I think in many ways my input was always from a kind of a human character level. I think about the way, I just say directorially that, a person crosses over. There's so many ways to do it. And I felt that, and maybe it's influenced by, Asian culture that's just embedded in me that I don't even know, but I wanted it to be more of a poetic moment and a transcendent moment. You look at, there is, and this isn't a spoiler, but there obviously was the moment of the attack on Hiroshima and the dropping of the bomb, which of course on many levels we think of, a big mushroom, right? That could be filling the stage on the projection screen or something. But I wanted to explore something that was a more personal experience of this kind of catastrophic world event. And along with Daryl Maloney, who was the projection designer, and I won't spoil it for those who haven't seen it, but we crafted a very personal way of having the bomb moment. And I think in many ways, my aesthetic with regards to those kind of moments are probably just influenced by my artistic kind of sensibility, kind of who I am, and perhaps maybe of, thinking about my culture, my background, my ancestors, and not, well, that's how they would do it, but influenced by maybe a great piece of art that I remember hanging in my mother's living room that she bought when we were, in China, and she went to an amazing place, and there was a man who was drawing something with charcoal. And so this notion of charcoal and this kind of diffused edge maybe influence some decision making on that. But from a human and character perspective, always making sure that the actors, how they responded to something, because not all of the actors were Japanese Americans, and there are differences between, which might be shock to some people. Not all Asian people think the same, talk the same, act the same, speak the same. So I think that was probably where, James, I was able to kind of give a different kind of nutrients based on my background.
I'm so glad you said that, because it's I think one of the difficulties, particularly in teaching in a university, is that we tend to say, here is the Black representation, here is the Asian representation, here is the Latinx representation, and forget actually that within that there are all sorts of smaller representations that need to happen that are often quite different to each other. And we quite often group all of the Asian musicals together, but actually the King and I is about Siam, or now Thailand, and Miss Saigon is about Vietnam, and so they're all quite different in a lot of ways. And I would encourage any of my students that are looking at this in the future to really think carefully about the context of each individual musical as well. But going on to the actors, I think that was the other thing that's really beautiful about Allegiance. But like you say, all of the actors will come from very different backgrounds as well. What do you find that the actors bring to the process at that sort of stage? So once you've gone through your development and all, I mean, I suppose the actors are involved a lot earlier, but what do the actors bring to the table in terms of representation, and how did that work within that process?
Well, it was, I think, as you just pointed out, a lot of the actors were with us right back from 2000 and, like way back there, 2008. So in so many ways, the show, not that it was ever written for them, and even George, who was there from before the first reading, the writers never wrote the show. It's not the George Takei story, but actors are such amazing creatures. They bring, whether it's their own experience, and we had a number of the actors on Broadway whose grandparents or relatives were actually in the internment camps. The gentleman who played Mike Masaoka, his father was in Heart Mountain, like right in where the story takes place. And so, when you hear Greg Watanabe, who played Mike Masaoka, share those kind of stories, it again brings a reminder to the entire cast, one, that this did happen, not that anyone questioned it, but that did happen, and it happened to somebody right next to me, his father, my father, actually in the camp. And what was so interesting also was that those who didn't have a connection to a relative or a family member in that situation, that the show was a learning opportunity for them, being perhaps Filipino American or Chinese American, and going, I knew of it, but I didn't know of it on this level. So, the great thing about theater is that we are constantly learning, and we're constantly kind of being sponges. And the actors who contributed because of first knowledge experience, because of their grandparents or their parents, were able to share it in that way. And those who didn't have that experience could also come at it from other perspectives, which inevitably you bring this melting pot together of all these a variety of different Asian friends, and it becomes a richer soup. And that doesn't mean that if it was all Japanese American people, that it would not be a rich soup. It's just bringing a lot of different perspectives, although what we all shared was Asian, right? So kind of the opposite of what we were saying before. We did look out into the sea of faces and go, okay, predominantly Asian. And I think in many ways, a tremendous amount of pride about being a part of this show, and being a part of the show that was in many ways an American show. This didn't take place in Japan or Vietnam or Siam or Thailand, etc. It actually took place in California. So an American story that was brought to life by Asian American friends.
It's just, I just love Allegiance. I mean, it's funny because I think there is a thing, particularly amongst white people like myself, that we think, oh, that's a show about Asian people, so it's not really for us. But actually, I think that's a really dangerous route to go down. It's one of the reasons why at the University of Wolverhampton that we try and make sure that we do look at stories from all over, from all over different experiences. I'm going to ask my students to start thinking about submitting some questions to the Q&A, and they can be about anything that we've talked about this evening. They can be about Allegiance, but also if you wanted to ask Stafford about his other work as well, I'm sure he would be happy to answer those questions. But I wanted to ask one other question while that's happening, and I was just interested in thinking about, because when we think about representation, we often think about specifically what's on stage, what we see explicitly. And I think that's really, really important and should be the first port of call. But I'm also quite interested in how you feel as an East Asian, as a Japanese American person, how you feel that's kind of that identity comes out in other musicals that you have worked on that maybe are not necessarily about Asian people.
Yeah, I think in many ways, James, I've always, I've never, in my work as a director, made conscious choices about, I need to make sure that, Asian people are represented, being an Asian person. What I've noticed, I guess, as a 52-year-old looking back at one's career and work, I've always been drawn to stories about the other. And whether that's Ragtime, whether that's Carrie, whether that was Bear, even Altar Boys, a fun musical, but they were all fish out of water, these 5 boy band members. I've always been intrigued by the other. When I was casting Carrie for the New York revisal, it's for me. There was a person, an actress that was hired. She's Asian. She was in the ensemble, but to me it was more about, well, we got to talk about the real world. The real world, you go, unless you're going somewhere very specific. There are students in high schools that aren't just beautiful white friends. So to me, to be true to a high school experience, and 2 shows that I kind of did back to back was Carrie and then Bear, the musical. Again, in Bear, there was an Asian person on the stage as well as a black person. But again, not because checking boxes or filling quotas. It was why not why not, like you just do what's real. If I was doing a show about London, England, I would hope that it wasn't just, it didn't look like necessarily the royal family. The royal family doesn't represent all of the UK in many ways, but so I think though that because the lens in the last few years has really kind of focused on that kind of the need for representation. And one might criticize me and say, actually, for you not to actually say, no, I have to have this, and this, was you not, fighting for representation. Even though I am a person of color, I obviously see color. It's not like I'm colorblind. I see color. I just wanted to always make sure that there was a truth on stage that made sense to a today audience. Again, if we were doing a very specific play that was not, and I wanted to keep it in that time period or whatever, maybe I wouldn't have picked a black friend or a Asian friend. I don't know. But I think that the good thing is that we are talking about it, and people are now having to make more conscious choices versus my situation, which was conscious, but not conscious because of race. It was conscious because of the kind of given circumstances of the situation, which is a high school in Maine, or whatever else might have been.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. And one of the really important things with this series of talks and lectures and Q&As that we're doing here is that we're definitely not going to be answering all the questions. There aren't answers to a lot of the things, but the fact that there are now questions is the really important thing. And hopefully the thing that students and people who go on to be performers or directors or work in any way within storytelling will be able to start to think about how they want to answer those questions. So we have got a question from one of our attendees here, which says, who are some of your biggest idols and inspirations in musical theatre?
Well, I think all of the individuals that I had mentioned who were mentors to me, starting from Harold Prince, Mike Ockrent, Frank Bellotti, Terrence McNally, Graziella Danielle, choreographer, Anne Reinking, a choreographer. I'm not a choreographer, but I was very lucky to have been in rooms and worked on productions with these great people. Stephen and Lynn, so Stephen Flaherty and Lynn Ahrens, who are the composer and lyricist of Ragtime. Big fans of them as composer and lyricist, but also Mike, I would not have a career if it wasn't for them. They were incredibly instrumental in very instrumental in giving me this opportunity to direct the West End production of Ragtime, along with the late great Terrence McNally. So I am huge fans of theirs, not only because of the brilliance of their work, but because of the mensch quality that they have as people. For those of you who don't know, a mensch is a Yiddish word for like a good person, real good, solid person. But you know, I continue to be really amazed at young, and I say young because again, I keep saying I'm over 50, directors and writers. Lauren Yee, who's an American writer who's written, I think I think my answer really is what excites me most right now is young friends of all colors and all genders and all representations who specifically through this pandemic never let go to the faith of I want to do this, and that light at the end of the tunnel, as far away as it might seem or felt, you know, a year ago, that they're still doing it. They're still doing it today. But I never got a chance to work or meet Michael Bennett. But as a director of musicals, I think that he was incredible, and that was actually my first Broadway show I ever saw. Was the original company of Dreamgirls at the Imperial Theater, and so they don't make them like they did, but that's okay because there's a new crop of exciting talents that are paving their ways into making their stamp on this great industry.
Thank you, Stafford. That's great. We've got a few more questions coming in now. So again, this is an anonymous one, but what were some of the biggest difficulties you faced with bringing Allegiance to stage?
I think inevitably the biggest the obstacles that were in our way was an industry's concern that the show wouldn't sell, or that no one would want to come to see a show about a stain on American history that is probably best forgotten. Like, why bring it up? Why are you perpetuating this story? So because there wasn't this kind of open arm, like whenever we have a theater, we'll give it to you. If it was a I don't know, a brand new show by Andrew Lloyd Webber, Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber, my apologies, Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber, and Cinderella, I'm sure that they'll be front of the line, they'll be moved right to the front of the line. So I think there was an industry concern about the material not being kind of commercial. But even though we had those obstacles, as I mentioned earlier, we had a producer, Lorenzo Tione, who was like, fine, we'll wait. We're not going anywhere.
That's great. Thank you very much, Stafford. And this is a question from Gemma. Hi, Stafford. What would you say is the most interesting and enjoyable piece of musical theatre you've been involved in? And what are your reasons behind that? That's a big question.
It's a big question, and I don't have children, but it would be like saying, who's your favorite child? And I'm going to give probably the answer you all expected. They're all my favorites for very different reasons. I in my career, I made very conscious choices of working on projects that I felt a real kinship towards. Maybe no one else liked Carrie or Allegiance, but I did. So I made choices that I knew that if I had to live with a show like an Allegiance for 8 years, or a Carrie that, started from 2000, if that was a 4-year period, I had so I guess versus doing a lot of shows, like 500 shows, but I could go, well, these three were my top faves. They all have a very special place in my heart, and also they all have a great story around them, and that excites me as well, because Allegiance has its own unique story versus, and not just the content, but the story of how it came to be. Carrie has its own story of how that came to be, and Altar Boys and whatever else. So,
And there's
didn't answer your question, Jenna. Sorry.
I mean, it's one of the really lovely things that's happened more recently as well, is that a lot of these things are now starting to be covered by things like podcasts. I mean, I know that there's a podcast on Carrie that's happened quite recently, and that's now hopefully something that might become a book or whatever it might be. And so some of these sort of stories, as you say, this not just the story that's on stage, but the story of how it got on stage, are starting to become much more accessible to us as well. And I one of the things I loved is when I visited you in Theatre Calgary, was seeing that you had all of the posters up of the shows that you'd worked on, and it's just such a wonderful range of shows, and I'm not surprised you can't pick one of them, to be honest. I've got one more question here. Do you have any advice for young aspiring directors?
Yeah. Mariah Carey many years ago sang a song called "Make It Happen." And that's the advice I would give to anybody. And I think this actually stays true with it. If you want to be a banker, or if you want to be a fashion designer, you got to make it happen. So what does that mean? Someone's saying, well, that's easy for you to say, make it happen. What that means for me, friends, is that you want to do something, you're going to do everything you can to make it happen. So you're going to immerse yourself, perhaps scholarly, go to school, go to class, read books. You're going to immerse yourself in that field. Maybe it's directing. You're going to see a lot of shows, from off West End to Broadway to an amateur production done at your church. You're going to experience a lot, so you can start kind of figuring out oh, this is how it's done. Maybe you'll go to something at a college, and it's a college production of Pippin or something, and there's something really unique about how they use the space. And then at some point, when I say make it happen, because obviously you can't just make it happen like, oh, well, I just want to direct a Broadway show, it's going to happen. But you can put into place a definite sense of energy, passion, and the doing of it, the doing of something that gets you closer and closer and closer. I use the Everest example, Mount Everest. If you want to climb a mountain, you can't just look up at it. At some point, you're going to have to take a step. At some point, you're going to have to put something in the rock to pull you up. At some point, you're going to have to make it happen. Now, you might fall, and you might not fall to your death. That was very dark and gruesome. But you might fall a couple of notches. Well, get back up. Keep going up that mountain. You have to make sure that there was a book, I don't know if it was popular in the UK, but a book called The Secret. And they said, you just have to close your eyes and hum and you'll get a Mercedes-Benz or whatever. And, I believe that you can definitely use vision boards and you can have wishful thinking, but you have to put those vision boards and wishful thinking into action. And here's the truth. I'm a kid from Toronto. I was born in Toronto. Nobody I knew worked in the theater. My parents weren't artists. I didn't have a relative in the United States who sponsored me to go to New York. I didn't know a Hal Prince. I didn't know a this. I didn't know nothing. How does a kid from Toronto inevitably work with Hal Prince, direct Carrie, blah, blah? How does it happen? Because I'm the most talented director? No. No, I'm not the most talented director. I can direct, great, but I know that I had a passion, and Carrie's a great example. I wanted to do that revival. And I was the one who said, I'm going to reach out to those authors and I'm going to make it happen. And from 2008 to 2000 and like 6 months, it took me to finally get those authors to agree to let me do a reading, not direct the whole thing, but to do a reading. I kind of felt that I made it happen, but it took 7 months to kind of make it happen. But that was a long answer, James, and whoever asked, but I hope that that gives you some inspiration.
That was perfect. Thank you, Stafford. I've got one final question here. I think it's quite a short question, but what's a show? Is there any shows that you'd like to direct but you haven't had the chance to yet?
I love Tennessee Williams, playwright, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Death, Streetcar Named Desire. You know, I most of the work that I've done, even though Carrie was kind of a revisal, it wasn't a revival because we kind of revised it. You know, I'm really interested in new works. So I think the show that I want to direct next hasn't been written yet. I would never want to direct Dreamgirls or Evita. Those are my two favorite musicals. One, because I think Hal's production is perfect. So why do it differently? No offense to the other one that was done, and I think Michael Bennett's production of Dreamgirls was perfect. So I'd love to direct Dreamgirls, but I would probably just want to like recreate Bennett's direction and choreography. So I think the next show I want to do has not been written yet, and look forward to whatever that might be.
And so do we. That's really exciting. I think we've come just about to, 8 o'clock here, 1 o'clock your time, I think. So we're at the end of the session. But Stafford, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us and for talking us through some of your experiences and talking to us in so much detail about Allegiance and all these other projects. And we do wish you all the best for whatever's next for you and for all the work that you're doing at Theatre Calgary as well. So I think we're at the end of the session there, but thank you very much for everyone for coming. Next week, we'll be talking to Rhys McKenzie about his show that was recently at the Arena Theatre. And we'll be talking to him a little bit about Black representation in musical theatre. But thank you very much, everybody, for this evening. Thank you again to Stafford. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you very much. Bye.
Stay safe, friends.
Thanks, Stafford. Bye.